Advanced Angular Top 100 Questions and Answers, your 2026 interview study guide brought to you by SYN. How would you prevent duplicate HTTP requests for the same data in Angular? A common approach is to keep data access in a service and share the result instead of letting every component fire its own request. In RxJS heavy code, Share Replay can multicast a single upstream request to multiple subscribers, and Angular interceptors can also centralize caching behavior when that fits the API pattern. When should you cache API responses in an Angular app, and when should you avoid caching them? Cache responses when the data is read-heavy, changes infrequently, or is expensive to fetch repeatedly, such as reference data, lookups, and feature configuration. Avoid aggressive caching for highly user-specific, rapidly changing, or security-sensitive data, unless you also have a clear invalidation strategy. What is the difference between browser HTTP caching and Angular Service Worker caching? Browser HTTP caching follows HTTP semantics such as cache control, ETAG, and conditional requests, and it applies whether or not you use Angular. Angular's Service Worker is a programmable cache layer in the browser that can cache application assets and configured data URLs, manage versions, and provide offline behavior beyond normal browser caching. How do you configure Angular's Service Worker to cache API data differently from static assets? You configure this in ng-swconfig. JSON static application files and dynamic data URLs are described separately, which lets you use different freshness, expiration, and update policies for assets versus API responses. How would you invalidate stale cache day in a production Angular application? Use explicit cache policies rather than assuming cache data will stay correct forever. For HTTP caching, that usually means validators like ETAG or last modified plus revalidation, while for Angular service workers, it means configuring data groups and update rules, so old content is refreshed instead of served indefinitely. How can an HTTP interceptor be used for authentication in Angular? An interceptor can inspect outgoing requests and attach common authentication information, such as an authorization header, before the request is sent. This keeps token handling logic out of every service method and makes the cross-cutting concern easier to test and change. How would you attach a bearer token to outgoing API requests safely? The standard pattern is to attach the token in the authorization header from a centralized HTTP interceptor. You should avoid putting bearer tokens in URLs because bearer tokens grant access to whoever possesses them and can leak through logs, history, and caches. What is the difference between authentication and authorization in an Angular application? Authentication answers who the user is, while authorization answers what that authenticated user is allowed to do. Angular can help you build the client experience around both, but the real enforcement of authorization must still happen on the server or resource API. Why should a browser-based Angular app use OAuth authorization code with PKCE instead of the implicit flow? Current OAuth guidance for browser-based apps favors authorization code with PKCE because it reduces risks around intercepted authorization codes and replaces older guidance that used the implicit flow. The implicit flow is now broadly discouraged for JavaScript apps in modern OAuth best practice documents. What is a bearer token, and why must it be protected carefully? A bearer token is an access token that can be used by whoever holds it, without additional proof of possession. That simplicity is why it is common. But it also means the token must be protected in storage and transport, because disclosure can be enough for misuse. Where should you avoid storing secrets in an Angular front end? Do not treat browser-delivered code as a safe place for secrets, such as client secrets, private keys, or privileged API credentials. Browser-based apps are public clients, which means the user can inspect the shipped code and runtime state. Where is it usually safer to keep access tokens in a browser-based Angular app? For browser-based apps, in-memory storage is generally safer than persisting tokens broadly in browser storage because it reduces passive exposure. If persistence is required, it should be chosen deliberately and with a clear threat model rather than as a convenience default. What is the difference between an access token and a refresh token? An access token is what the client sends to a resource server to access protected APIs. A refresh token is used to obtain a new access token when the current one expires, and it generally deserves stricter handling because it can mint more access tokens. How should Angular apps typically handle 401 unauthorized responses? Handle them centrally instead of scattering retry and redirect code across components. An interceptor can detect the 401, trigger a refresh or reauthentication flow as appropriate, and then either retry safely or send the user back through login if the session is no longer valid. What is CORS, and why does Angular not fix it on the client side? CORS is a browser security mechanism controlled by HTTP response headers from the server. Angular runs in the browser, so it cannot override the server's cross-origin policy. If the API does not allow the origin, the browser blocks access before Angular can help. What is XSRF protection in Angular HTTP client, and how does it work? Angular HTTP client supports the common cookie plus header pattern for XSRF protection. On eligible mutating same origin requests, an interceptor can read a token from a cookie and send it in a custom header so the server can verify the request came from the real application. What is cross-site scripting, or XSSI, and how does Angular HTTP client help with it? Cross-site scripting, or XSSI, is a JSON-related attack class where a response can be abused as executable script in some scenarios. Angular HTTP client recognizes the common non-executable JSON prefix used by servers and strips it before parsing the response. What is the difference between synchronous and asynchronous operations in Angular apps? Synchronous work completes before the next statement continues, while asynchronous work lets the browser keep moving and finishes later through callbacks, promises, streams, or events. In front-end applications, asynchronous work is crucial because blocking the main thread hurts responsiveness. Why are most web API calls asynchronous in Angular? Network I/O takes unpredictable time, so the browser exposes it through asynchronous APIs rather than freezing the UI until the server responds. Angular builds on that model through HTTP client RxJS, and now signal-friendly APIs such as HTTP resource. What is the difference between promises and observables in Angular? A promise represents one eventual result, while an observable can represent 0, 1, or many values over time. Observables also integrate naturally with cancellation, transformation, composition, and Angular's reactive patterns, which is why Angular leans on RxJS so heavily. When would you choose async await over RxJS in Angular code? Use async await when you truly need one eventual value, and the control flow is simpler that way. Use RxJS when you are dealing with streams, cancellation, multiple emissions, user input, route changes, repeated HTTP activity, or complex composition over time. How do you convert an observable to a promise in modern Angular RxJS code? Use first value from when you want the first emission, or last value from when you want the final emission after completion. That makes the intent explicit and replaces the older catch-all to promise approach. Why was to promise deprecated in RxJS? It was replaced because first value from and last value from express two different semantics more clearly. Using one of those functions avoids ambiguity about whether you expect the first value or the final value after completion. What is RxJS, and why is it so important in Angular applications? RxJS is a library for composing asynchronous and event-based programs using observables. Angular uses it pervasively for HTTP, forms, routing events, reactive composition, and advanced state or UI workflows, so experienced Angular developers are expected to be fluent in it. What is the difference between a cold observable and a hot observable? A cold observable creates its producer logic for each subscriber, which means each subscription can trigger separate work. A hot observable represents a shared producer that can emit independently of any one subscriber, which is why multicasting tools and subjects matter in Angular apps. What is the difference between subject, behavior subject, and replay subject? A subject multicasts values to current subscribers. A behavior subject also stores a current value and emits it immediately to new subscribers, while a replay subject can replay a configurable history of past values to late subscribers. When is behavior subject a better fit than a plain subject? Use behavior subject when consumers need an immediately available current value, such as selected filters, auth state snapshots, or the current view model. A plain subject is better when you only care about future events and do not need a current state seed. How does Share Replay help reduce repeated HTTP calls? Share Replay can multicast a shared upstream subscription and replay the latest value to later subscribers. In Angular services, that often means several components can consume the same loaded data without each triggering a separate network request. What problem does SwitchMap solve in real Angular apps? SwitchMap is ideal when a newer request should make an older one irrelevant, such as type-ahead search, route-driven reloads, or live filtering. It keeps the output aligned with the latest trigger, rather than letting stale work win the race. When should you use MergeMap instead of SwitchMap? Use MergeMap when each triggered inner operation matters and should be allowed to continue in parallel. It is a better fit for independent writes fan-out work, or cases where canceling an older operation would be incorrect. When should you use ConCatMap instead of MergeMap? Use ConCatMap when order matters, and later work should wait until earlier work completes. This is useful for serialized writes, ordered queue-like processing, or APIs that should not be hit concurrently for the same logical workflow. When should you use ExhaustMap in Angular forms or buttons? Use ExhaustMap when you want to ignore repeated triggers while one inner operation is already running. A common example is preventing double submit on a login or save button until the first request finishes. Why are depants time and distinct until changed common in search boxes? They reduce unnecessary work by waiting briefly for typing to settle and by skipping duplicate values. In Angular search UIs, that means fewer HTTP calls, less back-end pressure, and a better experience under real network latency. How do you cancel an in-flight HTTP request when the user types again? With Angular HTTP Client and RxJS, the usual pattern is to map input changes to requests with switch map, so older requests are unsubscribed when a newer value arrives. In browser APIs, more generally, cancellation is commonly represented by abort controller and abort signal. Why can nested subscriptions become a maintenance problem? Nested subscriptions make control flow harder to reason about, scatter cleanup responsibilities, and often create subtle race conditions or leak risks. Higher order mapping operators usually express the same logic more declaratively and keep the data flow flatter. How do you compose dependent API calls without callback pyramids in Angular? Use RxJS composition so each step is derived from the previous one rather than manually nesting subscribe calls. Operators such as switch map, concat map, and merge map let you model dependency, cancellation, or concurrency explicitly. When should you combine multiple API requests in parallel versus sequencing them? Run requests in parallel when they are independent, and latency matters more than order. Sequence them when later requests depend on earlier data, when ordering matters, or when the backend should not receive concurrent operations for that workflow. What is the difference between fork join and combine latest in Angular data flows? Fork join waits for all inner streams to complete and then emits their final values together, which is useful for one-time request bundles. Combine, latest emits whenever any source changes after each source has produced at least one value, which is better for ongoing reactive state. How should you handle transient HTTP failures without retrying unsafe operations blindly? Retry only when the failure is plausibly transient, and when repeating the request is semantically safe or explicitly supported by the backend. Centralizing retry logic in interceptors or well-structured pipelines makes it easier to limit retries, log them, and avoid accidental duplicate side effects. How do you place timeout, retry, and Karkashir in a pipeline without hiding root causes? Keep the pipeline explicit about which failures you expect and what should happen next. Timeout should represent an actual boundary, retry should be limited and intentional, and Character should either recover with a meaningful fallback or rethrow so callers can still observe the failure. What are common causes of memory leaks in RxJS-heavy Angular applications? Leaks often come from long-lived subscriptions that outlive the component, retaining references through closures or subjects that never complete. The risk grows when subscriptions are created imperatively in many places, instead of being composed or tied clearly to lifecycle. How can Signals and RxJS work together instead of competing? They solve different but overlapping problems. Signals are excellent for synchronous local reactive state in Angular, while RxJS remains strong for asynchronous streams and composition, and Angular provides official bridge utilities such as to Signal and to Observable for moving between them. When would you use to Signal for HTTP or route data? Use to Signal when you want synchronous signal style reads in the component after sourcing data from an observable, such as route params, route data, or a shared service stream. It can make the component API cleaner when the rest of the component already uses signals heavily. When would you use to Observable to bridge signal state back into RxJS? Used to observable when downstream logic expects an observable pipeline, such as operator-heavy async workflows, existing shared libraries, or interop with APIs built around RxJS. It is especially useful during gradual migration, where some parts of the app are signal first, and others remain stream first. Why should you avoid calling to signal repeatedly for the same observable? Each to-signal call creates a subscription, so repeating it for the same source can duplicate work and side effects. The better pattern is to create the signal once and reuse it wherever that state is needed. What is reactive state management in Angular? Reactive state management means representing state as reactive values and deriving views from it, rather than push-in G updates manually through imperative code. In modern Angular, that can involve signals, RxJS streams, or a store abstraction, depending on the scale and kind of state you are modeling. When is a simple service with signals enough for state management? It is often enough when the state is local to a feature or page, the rules are understandable, and you do not need advanced time travel, entity tooling, or a highly formalized update flows. Angular's DI and signal primitives make this pattern lightweight and testable for many mid-sized features. When should a large Angular application adopt a formal store library instead of ad hoc services? A formal store becomes worthwhile when state spans many features. Update rules are hard to trace. Debugging requires stronger discipline, or many teams need shared conventions. The goal is not fashion, but predictability, discoverability, and a clearer architecture for large-scale change. How do you distinguish local UI state, server state, and global app state in Angular? Local UI state belongs close to the component or feature. Server state represents data owned by the backend, and global app state covers cross-cutting concerns such as auth, theme, or current tenant. Separating those categories helps you avoid over-centralizing everything into one giant store. What are common mistakes when storing G server data as long-lived client state? A common mistake is treating G server-owned data as if the client were the source of truth, which leads to stale copies, invalid assumptions, and complicated invalidation. Another is caching user-specific or rapidly changing data without considering auth boundaries, freshness requirements, or back-end revalidation. How would you model derived state in Angular so you avoid duplicated data? Prefer storing the minimal source state and deriving the rest instead of persisting multiple redundant copies that can drift apart. In modern Angular, that often means computed signal style derivation or RxJS projection rather than mutating several related fields manually. Why is immutability helpful with Angular performance and predictable state updates? Immutability makes reference changes easier to reason about, which improves debugging and works naturally with Angular's optimized change detection strategies. It also reduces the chance that hidden in-place mutation will leave the UI and mental model out of sync. Which object-oriented design patterns commonly show up in Angular apps? Angular apps commonly use patterns such as facade, strategy, adapter, and factory, often combined with dependency injection rather than hard-coded construction. The framework itself also encourages separation of concerns through services, components, providers, and replaceable implementations. How is the dependency inversion principle reflected in Angular dependency injection? Instead of a class constructing its own collaborators, Angular encourages classes to depend on abstractions or tokens that the injector supplies. That keeps code more modular. easier to replace in tests, and less tightly coupled to one concrete implementation. How do injection token values help when the dependency is not a class? Injection token gives Angular a runtime token for values that have no runtime type representation, such as interfaces, functions, arrays, primitives, or configuration objects. That lets you inject typed non-class dependencies cleanly, instead of resorting to brittle string keys or concrete service wrappers everywhere. What is the difference between Conctus, useValue, useFactory, and useExisting providers? UseClass tells Angular to instantiate a class. useValue provides a fixed value. useFactory builds a value through a function, and useExisting aliases one token to another existing provider. The distinction matters because useExisting reuses an existing instance, while CACIMS can create a separate instance. When would you use a factory provider in Angular? A factory provider is useful when the dependency must be created from runtime information, feature flags, platform conditions, or other injected collaborators. It is a strong fit for configurable clients, environment-driven behavior, and selecting strategies without hardwiring them into constructors. What are multi-providers, and when are they useful? A multi-provider lets multiple registrations contribute values to one token, so the injector returns an array. This is useful for plugin style extension points such as interceptor chains, initialization hooks, or grouped strategy implementations. What are route-level providers, and why are they useful in large applications? Route-level providers scope dependencies to a route tree instead of the whole application. That is useful for feature isolation, lazy loaded areas, and cases where you want different service instances or configuration for different route branches. How do lazy loaded routes affect service instances and scope? Lazy loaded routes can create child injector scopes, so services provided there are not the same instances as root-provided services. That is powerful for feature isolation, but it also surprises teams who expected one shared singleton everywhere. Why can a service unexpectedly get recreated in Angular? A service gets recreated when it is provided in a narrower scope than you expected, such as a component, directive, or child route, instead of the root injector. The fix is usually not in the consumer, but in understanding where the provider is registered. How do you debug a time null injector error or provider scope mismatch? Start by checking whether the token was ever provided and in which injector hierarchy it lives. Angular's DI troubleshooting guidance and the injector tree in Angular DevTools help you verify whether the provider is missing entirely or simply scoped differently than the consumer expects. What does it mean that Angular has environment injector and element injector hierarchies? Angular resolves dependencies through more than one injector hierarchy. Environment injector covers application and environment-level providers, while element injector is created around components and directives, so narrower provider scopes can exist within the component tree. Why are functional interceptors often preferred over DI-based interceptors in modern Angular? Angular's current HTTP client setup guidance notes that functional interceptors have more predictable ordering. In large applications, that matters because deeply hierarchical DI configuration can make the order of DI-based interceptors harder to reason about. How would you implement request logging, correlation IDs, or tracing in Angular HTTP calls? This is a good fit for an interceptor because the logic applies to many requests and should stay consistent. The interceptor can stamp headers, measure timings, and log metadata centrally without polluting every service method with repeated cross-cutting code. How can an interceptor help with caching, retries, and auth without polluting services? Interceptors act like middleware around HTTP requests and responses, which makes them a natural place for behavior that is not specific to one feature. That keeps services focused on domain intent, while cross-cutting concerns such as auth, retries, caching, and logging remain centralized. What is HTTP resource, and when is it more convenient than HTTP client? HTTP resource is Angular's reactive HTTP API built around reactive dependencies and resource state. It can be more convenient than plain HTTP client when the request should react automatically to signal changes and expose loading, error, and value state together. What is the biggest behavioral difference between HTTP resource and HTTP client? HTTP resource is eager and reactive. When the signals it depends on change, it starts a new request and cancels any pending one. HTTP client, by contrast, returns an observable that does not do anything until something subscribes to it. How do data resolvers improve UX and server-side rendering, or SSR readiness for routed pages? Resolvers can fetch required data before a route activates, which avoids rendering a route shell first and then filling it in later. Angular's routing docs also call out that this is especially useful for data consistency and server-side rendering, or SSR, because the route can render with the needed data already available. When should data loading happen in a resolver instead of N, Shibaji init? Use a resolver when the data is required for the route to make sense immediately, or when navigation should depend on the outcome of the fetch. Use ng on init or a feature service when the data is optional, progressively enhanced, or not worth blocking route activation. How would you stop a slow route transition caused by overfetching? First, determine which requests are actually critical for first paint and move only those into the blocking path. Then reduce redundant calls through caching. Parallelize independent work where possible, and defer or lazy load non-essential data so navigation does not wait on everything at once. How do you troubleshoot a page that renders slowly because of change detection? Profile it rather than guessing. Angular DevTools and Chrome DevTools can show slow change detection cycles, and Angular's performance guidance recommends reducing unnecessary checks, skipping subtrees where appropriate, and eliminating expensive computations in templates or lifecycle hook. What is zone pollution, and how can it hurt Angular performance? Zone pollution happens when asynchronous work that does not actually change application state still causes Angular to run change detection repeatedly. Timers, animation loops, and third-party libraries are common sources, and the fix is often to move that work outside Angular's zone or redesign the trigger path. When should you run work outside Angular zone? Run work outside Angular zone when it does not need Angular error handling or UI updates on every async callback. That is especially useful for noisy timers, animation frames, and third-party async activity that would otherwise trigger unnecessary change detection. What is the difference between Mark IV check and detect changes in practice? Mark IV check schedules Angular to consider an onPush view dirty on a future change detection pass, while detect changes forces change detection for that view immediately. In practice, Mark IV Check is usually the less intrusive choice when you want to stay aligned with Angular's normal scheduling model. Why are expensive methods or getters in templates a performance smell? Angular may evaluate template expressions frequently during change detection, so expensive logic there multiplies quickly. Angular's performance guidance explicitly recommends identifying and optimizing slow computations in templates and lifecycle hooks, rather than hiding them inside seemingly harmless getters or methods. How do you use Angular dev tools to find slow components? Use the profiler view to record and inspect change detection activity, then drill into the components that consume the most time. Angular dev tools can show where time is spent, so you can focus on the expensive components instead of optimizing blindly. How do Chrome DevTools and Angular DevTools complement each other? Angular DevTools explains framework-level behaviors such as component trees, injectors, and change detection costs. Chrome DevTools gives the broader browser picture such as network waterfalls, CPU timelines, rendering costs, and real performance traces. So together, they help you separate Angular problems from browser or backend problems. What would you check first when an Angular app feels slow but CPU usage looks low? Check the network path before blaming rendering. Slow APIs, request waterfalls, missing caching, bad transfer strategy, or throttled conditions can make an app feel sluggish even if Angular itself is not doing much CPU work. How do you troubleshoot slow web API calls from an Angular application? Start in the browser's network panel and separate DNS. Connect time to first byte, or TTFB, download and payload issues from front-end rendering issues. Then check whether you are overfetching, missing caching, or compression opportunities, serializing requests unnecessarily, or reissuing the same call from multiple places. How do you tell whether a slow screen is caused by the backend, the network, or Angular rendering? Use network tools to inspect request timing, status codes, payload size, and waterfalls. Then use performance tooling to inspect CPU and rendering. If the network is fast but the screen is still slow, the issue is likely in rendering or change detection. If time to first byte or TTFB or transfer dominates, the bottleneck is upstream of Angular. How can route resolvers, caching, and transfer cache reduce repeated waiting on first load? Resolvers can ensure critical route data is ready before activation. Caching can keep repeated requests from hitting the network unnecessarily, and transfer cache can reuse server-side rendering or SSR-fetched responses during hydration. Together, they reduce duplicate fetches and make the first meaningful view appear with less repeated waiting. What is HTTP transfer cache during server-side rendering or SSR and hydration, and when is it useful? During server-side rendering or SSR, Angular can cache eligible HTTP responses and reuse them during client hydration, so the browser does not immediately repeat the same request. It is useful for first load data that was already fetched on the server and can safely be reused on the client. Why does Angular exclude authorization header requests from default transfer caching? Because those requests often return user-specific data. Caching and replaying them by default can be unsafe. Angular's server-side rendering, or SSR guidance, explicitly excludes requests with authorization or proxy authorization headers, unless you deliberately opt in and know the response is safe to share in that way. What guarantees does the Angular Service Worker provide about app versions across tabs? The Angular service worker tries to keep a running application on one coherent app version, even if a newer version is deployed in the background. That means one existing tab can continue on the old version, while a newly opened tab gets the new version, which is stronger consistency than the default web deployment model provides. Why can a service worker-powered app still serve stale data after deployment? Because caches are designed to trade freshness for speed and resilience, and the Angular service worker may continue serving cached content while revalidating or until an update policy says otherwise. Misconfigured cache groups, non-atomic deployments, or stale intermediate caches can all contribute to surprising freshness behavior. How do you decide between client-side rendering, server-side rendering, or SSR, and an offline first PWA? Choose based on the product's needs, not ideology. Server-side rendering, or SSR, helps with first-load HTML and search engine optimization, or SEO. CSR can be simpler and cheaper when search engine optimization, or SEO is less critical. And a service worker-backed PWA is valuable when offline behavior, installability, or resilience matters more than server-rendered first paint. When is Angular hydration worth the complexity? Hydration is worth it when you already want server-side rendering or SSR, and you care about reuse-ng server-rendered DOM and data instead of throwing it away and rendering again on the client. It is less compelling if the app does not benefit much from server-side rendering or SSR in the first place, or if the hydration constraints create more complexity than the UX gain justifies. What kinds of bugs cause hydration mismatches? Hydration mismatches often come from client and server producing different DOM. Mutisng server-rendered HTML before hydration completes, or relying on browser-only behavior during server-side rendering, or SSR. Angular's error guidance also points to altered server-side rendering or SSR content as a direct source of hydration failure. How do you debug expression changed after it have checked in a real app? Treat it as a signal that the view changed after Angular thought it had stabilized, not as a message to silence. Look for mutation during late lifecycle timing, side effects in getters or template methods, or a child-to-parent writes that change bindings after the initial check. How do you debug no provider found and similar DI errors quickly? Read the missing token carefully, then trace whether it was provided at all and whether the consumer lives in the same injector scope. Angular's Error Encyclopedia, DI Troubleshooting Guide, and DevTools Injector Tree make it faster to distinguish a missing provider from a scope mismatch. What does NG0207 mean? And where can environment providers legally be used? NG0207 means environment providers were supplied in a context that only accepts regular providers. They belong in environment injectors such as Bootstrap application or route configurations, not in a components providers array. Why is it dangerous to bypass Angular sanitization casually? Angular treats bound values as untrusted by default and sanitizes them to reduce cross-site scripting or XSS risk. Bypassing that protection transfers the burden to you, so it should happen only for values you have genuinely validated and understand in the relevant security context. Why does Angular recommend trusted types and CSP for stronger cross-site scripting or XSS defense? Angular's built-in sanitization is valuable, but trusted types and content security policy add browser-enforced layers that make DOM-based cross-site scripting or XSS harder to introduce or exploit. They also make security reviews clearer because unsafe sinks and bypasses become more visible and constrained. How should you design Angular services so they remain testable and replaceable? Keep services focused, inject their collaborators instead of constructing them directly, and expose contracts that are easy to stub or swap. Angular's DI model and provider options are specifically designed to support isolation in tests and alternative implementations in different environments. What is the facade pattern, and how is it useful in Angular feature areas? A facade is a thin feature-facing API that hides lower-level orchestration details, such as HTTP calls, multiple streams, or store interactions. In Angular, it can simplify components, keep templates cleaner, and reduce the number of framework-specific details spread across a feature. How do container presentational component boundaries help large Angular codebases? They help by separating orchestration and data fetching concerns from rendering concerns. That usually makes reuse easier, tests simpler, and performance tuning more targeted because your rendering components stay relatively dumb and predictable. What does a scalable Angular architecture look like for an experienced team? A scalable Angular architecture keeps feature boundaries clear, centralizes cross-cutting concerns, uses DI intentionally, and chooses the lightest state approach that still remains understandable. The best teams also profile performance, treat security and auth as system concerns, and avoid accidental complexity such as duplicated fetching, hidden mutable state, or unclear provider scopes. How do you reproduce slow user conditions locally before optimizing an Angular app? Use DevTools to throttle network and CPU conditions, and reproduce the exact screens or interactions that feel slow in the field. Local reproduction is not the whole story, but it is the fastest way to validate whether an optimization actually changes the user experience under constrained conditions. Why should you measure real user metrics instead of relying only on local lab tests? Lab tests are great for controlled comparison, but they do not represent the full spread of real devices, networks, and user behavior. Field measurement complements local profiling by showing what actual users experience, which keeps Angular performance work focused on the bottlenecks that matter in production. Wow, you have made it all the way to the end. We want to thank you for your time and wish you the very best in your studies. We hope you learned something from this video. Remember, do what you love and love what you do every day. We'll see you on the next video.